Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Due to the hiccups that we had on our session yesterday, I promised to do a video and send it to you guys. So let's get into it. I'll start by sharing the assessment itself, and this is the question. Question 3 is a case study. You should have read through it. I will not read through it in this video, but basically this is a table of the list of suppliers or the tender list. So the first point, as you all know, is to transpose this into Microsoft Excel. And for that, let me share what I've done already. So this is the same information in a Microsoft Excel spreadsheet. So the first thing, as you all know, the question says we should select a number of suppliers where we have the minimum cost possible, but we have a minimum of 700 sensors, 5 Wi-Fi access points, and 700 transmitters. So we understand the constraints that we have. To start this problem, what you need to do is, since you are deciding on which authors or which suppliers to select, you need to include a decision variable. And we would insert a new cell and we would label it decision variables. And we are going to use 1 for each because we would have to set this as a binary, right? It can either be 1 to show that we have selected this supplier, or 0 to say we have excluded or omitted the supplier. Okay, 1 for including the supplier and 0 for omitting or excluding the supplier. So we need, for a start, to add that. So first, we have to calculate a scenario where there are no constraints. If we had to take everything from every supplier, what would that scenario be? So we start with what would be the cost, and the cost would be equal to, it would be a sum product of the function to include all the different suppliers, that is the decision variable, given, and here you will use a comma, their cost. So it will be 19,600, and when I click on that, you would see the function here, or the formula. I double click, you see the formula clearly, that it is a sum product of the decision variable to include all the 8 suppliers given their cost, and it gives you a total of 19,600. So how many sensors, let's start with sensors. How many sensors do we get if we take all suppliers? Again, it would be the same, a sum product of including all 8 suppliers, use the comma, given the total number of sensors that each supplier provides. And if you hit enter, you have 2,220 sensors in total. Again, if I double click on this, you see it is a sum product of including all the different suppliers given the number of sensors that each provides. So it would be the same for Wi-Fi access points, right? The sum product, all suppliers included, given what they supply. And lastly, for transmitters, the sum product including all suppliers given the total number of transmitters, all suppliers, so you hit the comma, given the total number of transmitters, enter. So there would be 1750 in total, right? So this is the situation where there are no constraints, but we know that there are constraints that have been given, and here are the constraints from cell A6 to A8. 700 sensors minimum, 5 Wi-Fi access points minimum, and 700 transmitters minimum. So these are the constraints. This is where it gets interesting. Let's get into Solver. You go to your data function and you see Solver in Microsoft Excel, right? You click on Solver, and the first is what objective are we looking to attain? What is the optimization objective? We are looking to minimize cost. And where is the total cost? We find it here in cell D12, right? So you would select cell D12. You hit enter, it appears, okay, I've done it twice. Let's just remove that. You click to select cell D12. So that is, we are setting our objective in cell D12. That's the total cost. And we are looking to minimize it. So we are setting objective D12 to minimize the total cost. And how do we minimize the cost? What is the changing variable? It would be the decision whether or not to include whichever supplier it is. So our decision variable cells would then be our changing variable. It's here, where we are choosing either to include or to exclude a supplier. If you hit enter, so our changing variables, so we are setting this objective to minimize this by changing the variables in these cells. The cells from C1 to, I think it's from C5, sorry, from C5 to J5. Okay, so we need to then add our constraints, right? The first constraint we all know is that there should be a minimum of 700 sensors. So the cell reference is, this is the total number of sensors without a constraint, but we are saying what is in cell D13 should be greater or equal to 700, right? Because that is the constraint that we need a minimum. So greater or equal to 700. And we hit OK. That's the first constraint that is set. We add the second constraint for Wi-Fi access points. Wi-Fi access points with no constraint will be 21. But then we need to have a minimum, so greater or equal to 5. Okay, we add this constraint, and then the last constraint with respect to the number of items is transmitters, which will be 1750 if there are no constraints, but then we need to set it to be greater or equal to 700 as well. Okay, and when we add, here we have our 3 constraints. Hope clear up to this point. So next, we are going to add other constraints as well with respect to our decision variable. The first one is that our decision variable has to be an integer. An integer, why? You cannot work with fractions. You cannot have half a supplier. If we talk about supplier 1, we either include supplier 1 or we don't include. So you cannot have 1.5. You cannot have 1.5. That's why we have to set that integer constraint. And what we do is select it all and set it to be an integer. Okay, we add that. So we have set C5 to J5, which is our decision variable, to be an integer. Additionally, we have to set another constraint. Remember, the question here is to add or not to add a supplier, or to select or not to select a supplier. And here we need to set this as a binary function, where 1 would say we are adding that supplier, and if it is 0, we are excluding the supplier. So we need to set, this decision variable as well into a binary function. And for that, we select the decision variable and set it as a binary function. Okay, binary 1 or 0. When it is 1, that means it is included. When it is 0, it's excluded. Okay, so now we have all our constraints in place, and we make sure that yes, the unconstrained variables are non-negative, because we cannot have a negative for supplier. It will not make sense. And we are using the linear programming, the simplex linear programming. When all this is set, all you need to do is hit solve and let Excel do So solver says they have found a solution and all constraints and optimality conditions are satisfied. Okay. And you see the cost that solver has calculated is 5,700 and all the constraints have been met with 720 sensors, 6 Wi-Fi access points and 700 transmitters. And if you come up here, you would see that in the decision variable, it has decided to include supplier 1, exclude supplier 2, include supplier 3, exclude 4, 5, include 6, exclude 7 and 8. So it has decided to include only supplier 1, supplier 3, supplier 6, 1, 3, and 6. And if you add the total cost of supplier 1, 3, and 6, you realize it's 3,000 plus 2,100. That's 5,100 plus 600, making the 5,700 we have here. It's the same thing if you go to look at the total sensors that they supply as well as the total Wi-Fi access points and the total transmitters. Okay, so this is why we say you can use solver to be able to optimize this in milliseconds compared to trying to kind of calculate it manually. Okay, the second part of the question gave other constraints as well, that there need to be a minimum of 4 suppliers supplying sensors and 4 suppliers supplying transmitters. So what do we do? For sensors, I will just put 4 here. That is a new constraint that has been set. And for transmitters, I have 4. That's the second part of question 3. It's saying we need to have a minimum of 4 suppliers supplying sensors and 4 suppliers supplying transmitters. But then we need to calculate what would be the total number of the total number of suppliers that supply sensors and the total number of suppliers that supply transmitters. And for that, I would just say it's equal to, and I would go and calculate. Here are the sensors. Supplier 1 supplies sensors, so I would say 1, right, plus supplier 2 does not supply sensors, so I'm not adding supplier 2, but supplier 3 supplies sensors. Supplier 4 supplies sensors, plus 5 as well, plus 6, plus 7, plus 8, right? So given this situation, or the situation where now we have 3 suppliers that have been included, and again it is 1, 3, and 6, but we're calculating the total number of suppliers who supply sensors. That is the ideal. How many suppliers supply transmitters? I would say same. Supplier 1 does 1, plus 2 also supplies transmitters, so 2, plus 3 does as well, 3, plus number 4, supplier 4 does not supply, so I'll skip that. 5 does, plus 6 does not supply, but 7 does, and also 8. So from the last solution, you see that there are just 2, but we have a total of 6 suppliers that supply sensors and 5, even though not selected here, right? But we need, the constraint here is 4. We need a minimum of 4. What would be the minimum cost if at least 4 suppliers were supplying sensors and at least 4 suppliers were supplying transmitters? So that's what we need to calculate. So now we are going again into solver, and we are going to add the constraints. Okay, so we add, and we are saying this, the total number of suppliers who are supplying sensors here, I'll just select this, should be greater or equal to, they say a minimum of 4, and that's what I put in here, should be greater or equal to that. So that constraint is added as well, and you can see it, yes, that is added. The second constraint as well then is that the total number of suppliers who supply transmitters should also be greater or equal to 4. So we add. So that is the second constraint as well. Every other thing remains the same, and all we do is hit solve. And a solution is found. Okay? And you realize that if we set the constraint that a minimum of 4 suppliers are needed, then the minimum cost is 10,000. And you would see how many suppliers are selected here. Supplier 1, supplier 2, supplier 3, supplier 6 and 7. They have been selected to supply their sensors. If you add the total number of sensors, we will have 770. And also the number of transmitters would be 950. Okay? And the minimum cost would be at 10,000. So this is basically what you are expected. You are expected to do in question 3 of your assessment. I hope this is pretty clear. It is a video. If you need clarification, you can always rewind, pause, and try to do it by yourself. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, and you have a nice evening. Goodbye.